Welcome to lesson 10 of the Hebrew course, where we will look at exercise 8 in the material, and the principal subject of exercise 8 is the imperfect. So up until now we've looked at the perfect. We've seen various perfect forms, and the perfect, as I've said, usually indicates past tense relative to where the speaker is. So it can be pluperfect, it can be perfect, it can be also something that's just happened. If I give you something, I can say I've given you, since it's the act is completed in the moment that it's said. Also future perfect is possible. Also, of course, rhetoric uses of the perfect are possible. When God speaks, when the sort of prophets report the word of God, they will let God speak in often imperfect of what is going to happen. That's probably a rhetorical device, showing that when you use the perfect for what's going to happen, you can, since it's God speaking it, it's certain that it will happen, and hence you use a tense that indicates that it's in a sense already happened. Now the imperfect is a modal form. The imperfect is sometimes found in the past, but more often in the present-ish circumstances and in the future. And a modal form means that modal verbs are very often necessary to translate it properly. I can do, I will do, I must do, I should do, and so on. Must, can, should, would. That's called a modal verb. Now the real present, as in, for instance, right now I'm speaking. Real present is not indicated by the imperfect, but rather by the participle, actually. So, ani medaber would be the correct term for what I'm doing. I am speaking in a participle. Okay, so as usual, let's look at the actual Hebrew exercise, the sentences. Sentence 1 is Yahweh mi yishkon behar kodshacha holech tamim ufoel tzedek vedover emet bilvavo. Yahweh, who dwells, or who can dwell rather, on the mountain of your holiness, walking perfectly. In other words, he who walks perfect, he who walks unblemished, and does rightness, acts righteously, and speaks truth in his heart. Okay? 2. Lutichot brit et ha'amim ha'ele. You must not, you should not, you cannot, you will not cut or make a covenant with these peoples. So again, the imperfect modal, can, should, will, would, so on. 3. Zot briti asher tishmoru beni uvenachem uven zarachem acharechem. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me, between you, and between your offspring after you. 4. Lo emshol ani bachem velo yimshol beni bachem Yahweh yimshol bachem. I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you. 5. Zot briti asher echarot et bet Yisrael echtov et torati al libam. This is the covenant which I will cut or make with the house of Israel. I will write my law on their heart. We can analyze this sentence a bit in depth. Zot is the demonstrative pronoun, feminine, singular, because Brit is feminine, singular. Brit is covenant. Ha Brit is the covenant. Now Zut Ha Brit means this is the covenant. If you wanted to say Ha Brit, if you wanted to say this covenant and not this is the covenant, this covenant would be Ha Brit Hazot. So the attributive, the so-called attributive use of an adjective, like the demonstrative pronoun, which is an adjective here, this covenant, habrit hazot. But if you want to use, if you want to have predicative use here, you say zot habrit. This is the covenant, asher echrot, which I will cut or make with the house of Israel. With the house of Israel. Et here is the preposition et and not the object marker, right? With the house of Israel, I will write my law on their heart. My law, Torah is law, I is mine, but it's not Torah I, because the construct state form of the noun is used in front of a pronominal suffix. So the construct state of Torah is Torat, right? Feminine a endings in the singular become at in the construct state. So Torati, my law. Al-libam, am is a suffix for third masculine plural. It can be am, it can be him, as you've seen, and on their heart. Now maybe I should say something about the form of the imperfect. The imperfect is also sometimes called the prefix conjugations, and that is because the perfect is characterized by the prefix. Just in a sense, I mean, in order to remember it, you might think of the perfect as a more simple form, and then the imperfect as the form with a prefix. Im is sort of a prefix to perfect, so imperfect has a prefix. And these prefixes can be yi, that's a third person prefix, ti, which is second person prefixes, also third person feminine, singular is ti, and e for I, or ni for us, for we. So in this five we've seen two echrot, echtov rather, I will cut and I will write, echtov, echrot, the meaning I, and then imperfect, and then the root, in this case echrot, the fourth word is I will cut, kaf, resh, tav, so in front of the root, and there you go. Now we talk about O imperfects and A imperfects. So in the examples here, it's echrot and echtov. That's O imperfects. That goes. This refers to the second vowel of the imperfect, the vowel between the second and third consonant, root consonants. Sometimes that consonant is A, sometimes it's O. And well, with some verbs it's A, some verbs it's O. If it's O one time with one verb, you can be sure that it's also always O, and the same thing with A. So we can say that karat and katav are have O imperfects, whereas the imperfect in the next sentence, sentence 6, is an A imperfect. Eslach, forgive. Eslach, incidentally, words, verbs and roots that have gutturals at the end are always A imperfect. See, the thing is with gutturals, right? Remember the four guttural consonants, the aleph, chet, aleph, he, chet, and ein. These four consonants are gutturals, called gutturals, produced in the larynx, and they cannot lengthen, right? Remember that when they're supposed to lengthen, for instance, if there's a min, there's a nun from a min preposition, or if there's a definite article in front of them, they were supposed to lengthen, but they cannot. They do not lengthen, and that's one rule. This rule they share with the resh, the consonant resh. However, another rule, another sound rule is connected to the gutturals, namely the fact that they prefer the vowel A. So they will not, no verbs that end in gutturals are A imperfects, are O imperfect. They don't like the vowel O there. They prefer the vowel A, so they're A imperfects. So eslach ki eslach la'avonam ul chatatam lo ezkor od. Ki here some probably means for I will forgive to their sin, meaning I will forgive their sin, and their iniquity, chatatam, I will not remember further. 7. Al tishkach et ha'aniyim. Do not forget the poor. See, imperfect is more than one thing. We have regular imperfect, which we've seen up until now, but we also have what we call a short imperfect. Other people call it jasiv, and we also have a long imperfect. The long imperfect ends in a, and it's only found in the first person, and it's sort of it means sort of let us do this or let me do that. In the second and third person, we have this short imperfect form sometimes. Well, many times the form will not be shorter than a normal imperfect, but in some forms you can see that it's shorter. That's why it's called the short imperfect. And you can recognize the short imperfect by its place in the sentence. The short imperfect will always be in the beginning of a sentence. It can only be preceded by the negation al, or by the v, and. In rare cases, you see that it's pushed back in the sentence. That's only when another volative form, as for instance the jasiv, has just been mentioned, so it can be moved. We have that a couple of times in Genesis 1 actually, but that's rare. Whereas the regular imperfect never will be in the first spot. Regular imperfect, as we've seen here, will always be further back in the verse, never in the first spot. Okay. The meaning of the short imperfect is volitive. It is command-ish. The thing is that you're not allowed to. We haven't seen the imperatives yet. We'll see them. We'll see them soon. But you're not allowed to use a negation in connection with an imperative. So if you can't say don't do that, right? You have to say you shouldn't do that. You can't say don't do that. You have to say you shouldn't do that. You have to use an imperfectish form, namely the short imperfect, with then the negation al. We've seen the negation lo a lot, meaning that's the regular negation used with verbs, don't or no. But with the short imperfect, you use the al. Al can only be used with short imperfect, and it is then a prohibition. You prohibit something. Yes. 8. Hakone al yismach. The buyer should not be happy. Kone is a participle, and it's substantivized. Kone is buying, but the buying, meaning the one who buys, the buyer. Al yismach, should not be happy. A special case here with the jasiv pushed back in the sentence. Yismach is here the third person, and again the short imperfect. How can we see that it's the short imperfect here? Well, since it's sitting there in a strange place in the sentence, well, we can see that by the presence of al. The negation al can only be used with the short imperfect. 9. Yishretzu hamaim sheretz nefesh chaya. Let the waters swarm with a swarm of living beings. Yishretzu then is an imperfect that is in the beginning of the sentence, hence a jasiv, or a a short imperfect. And they're giving a sort of a command. The waters should swarm with a swarm of living beings. Yishratsu, having the prefix which is the marker of the imperfect, and ending in u, which is the plural ending, as we've seen also in the perfect. Then we have Hamaim, which is the subject. Hamaim is, well, formally, at least it used to be singular, but here at this stage of the language is considered a plural. Hence Yishratsu, hence a plural when Maim, water, is the subject. Sheretz Nefesh Chaya, a swarm of living being. Nefesh Chaya is living being. It's a singular, but it's a collective. It's very common to use singular nouns to indicate a totality of something, a group of something. Living beings, we call them collectives. Good. Like, for instance, if I say I bought fruit, fruit is a singular verb, but when I say I bought fruit, you'll understand that it will be more than one fruit, probably. I bought wood for my stove, you'll understand that I bought a lot of pieces of wood, but I still use the singular wood, and so on. That's very common in Hebrew. Sheretz is in the construct state, a swarm of living beings. 10. Kol Esev Hasadeh Terem Yitzmach. None of the plants of the field or the steppe had yet sprouted. Now, kol usually means all, but when the word kol is used in front, or if you have in connection with a negation, like terem means not yet. So kol used in connection with a negation means none. It simply strengthens the negation. None of the plants of the steppe had yet sprouted. 11. Nidrasha devar Yahweh me'et hanavi. Let us seek the word of Yahweh from the prophet. In other words, looking for an oracle. I mean, asking the prophet for an oracle. Nidrasha is the long imperfect, ending as it does in a long a, and it is it means let's go get an oracle of Yahweh from the prophet, through the prophet. Me'et is a compound. It consists of min, from, and et, with. Et, the preposition, combined with min, from, with the prophet, meaning from the prophet. 12. Nismacha belohim. Let us rejoice in God. Again, a long imperfect. Nismacha belohim. 13. Eshma'a lekol Yahweh. I will listen to this voice of Yahweh, meaning I will obey Yahweh. Eshma'a, I will listen. Let me listen. The meaning of the long imperfect is that, let me listen. 14. Yishput et ha'ir hara'a hazot. He should judge this evil city. He should judge, yishput. We have the verb in the beginning of the sentence, so we know that it's a short imperfect, and hence volative. He should judge this evil city. Ha'ir hara'a hazot. That's it for this exercise. Thank you.